We encourage you to hit the subscribe button right now so you can listen to more podcasts of Operation Truth. Ladies and gentlemen, we do want to hear from you, so we encourage you to email us directly at operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. I want you to know that your messages are likely to be heard, addressed, and listened to on air.
Operation Truth, the show they don't want you to see. Now, here's your host, Lou.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lou Palumbo. This is Operation Truth. You can contact us through operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. At the end of the last podcast, you heard me reference some topics like money being sent to the Ukraine, why Putin is a little raised up about what might be going on with the Ukraine in regards to potential threat to his country. We're going to give you a little backstory on Europe. We're going to touch again about this border issue because you need to understand the severity of this problem. It's going to redefine this country. If you're not watching the news, you might want to turn it on. Periodically, they give you some information that's worth listening to, although we all know that the media is at the say because they've become extensions of our political entities. I want to start with you, Tom, if I may, because Zelensky was in Washington, D.C. last week. I guess he was pandering for money. And, you know, we have a request of another $60 billion. We've already given like $115 billion or $120 billion. Now we want to give him another $60 billion. Tom, would you be so kind as to tell us where some of this money is going once it hits the Ukraine?
Well, some of it's being stolen and sent other places. Some of the equipment, the military equipment, is showing up in the Middle East, in Africa, in Mexico. So that's part of the problem, that there's little accounting for what we send them, that it actually gets where it's supposed to go. As far as the cash, we're basically supporting the Ukraine more than we support our own 50 states. So people joke that it's the 51st state of the United States because we're paying for their government, their pensions, their agencies to function. Now, a couple of years ago, Samantha Power, who is the head of USAID, a division of the State Department that doles out money around the world, she went to Kiev and announced that the U.S. had, with tech companies, had helped develop an app which citizens of the Ukraine could put on their computers and phones, and it would help them access government services, whether it's information about their pensions or their insurance policies or other issues being funded by the United States. So much of the money that's gone to the Ukraine for the most recent couple of years has gone to pay for the government, like I said, as a 51st state. Now, the issue turning on Ukraine goes back several years. You know, a lot of people feel like Putin invaded because he's evil and he's trying to go from the Ukraine all the way across Europe, and eventually we'll be fighting him. He'll be in Manhattan in a couple of years, and we'll be fighting the Russian army there. Now, in all the years that Putin's been in power, he allowed the military to really not be that strong of an offensive military. So when he sent tanks in 2022 into Kiev, into Ukraine, it was basically because he wanted to send a message that he was serious. Ukraine cannot join NATO. It has to be a neutral state. And he was just trying to send the message, please negotiate with me. Zelensky negotiated with Putin, and they had pretty much come to an agreement that Ukraine would stay neutral and that Russia then would withdraw its armed forces from the Ukraine land, especially the capital of Kiev. Then what happens is Zelensky gets a visit from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who goes to Kiev and tells him, no, I'm speaking for myself, the President of the United States, and for NATO. You will not negotiate. You will not come to an agreement with the Russians. We will give you everything you're ever going to need to fight Russia, to go after Russia. Now, Russia at that point has a couple 100,000 people in their military. Russia backs up and decides, we better start producing a strong military to protect ourselves, because NATO and the Ukraine and the United States are going to be right on our border. And if they put those missile launchers and equipment on the border, Ukraine and Russian border, they can launch missiles that can strike our capital, Moscow, in 8 minutes. And Putin said, that's unacceptable. Stay neutral and we're fine, then we'll back up. Well, when it's announced they're not going to stay neutral, and we're making public statements, our president, Biden, is making statements, we're with you all the way. We will back you as long as it takes. Now, you notice that was 2 years ago. So Russia goes to 24/7 military production, arms, missiles, ammunition. They beef up their military from a couple 100,000 potential soldiers to now at about 1 million. And then activating more and more reserves and increasing their training. Now, meantime, the rhetoric out of our White House and out of Joe Biden, his mouth, changed in the last couple of weeks. It used to be, we'll back you as long as it takes. Now, we'll back you as long as we can. Well, what does that mean? Till we run out of ammunition, till it's going to affect our election, till we can't do it. What? And that's where we're at now, is that the United States is somewhat backing off the commitment to the Ukraine. Now, the other thing, it's kind of reminiscent, and if you're old enough to remember, we were in Vietnam, basically, as advisors in the early 60s. When Johnson becomes president, we start committing troops to where we get up to over 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. Now then, by 1975, we pretty much realize it's not working. We're not helping like we say we're gonna. So we decide we're gonna leave. So in April of 75, we depart. We pull our soldiers out of Vietnam. And then what we say in Washington is, we did all we can. We gave them all we could. It's their fault they lost. We gave them what they needed to win, and they didn't win. And I think that, I'm just going to predict here, that the rhetoric about Ukraine in the couple of months ahead here is going to be very similar. Well, we gave them hundreds of billions of dollars to beat the Russians, and they didn't do it. Must be their fault. Not ours. We gave them everything we could, but they didn't accomplish the mission of defeating Russia.
Tom, but can I ask you a question, buddy? Because you and I have spoken about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it's important for the listeners to understand this. Are we paying pensions for employees in the Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing it for a couple of years.
That's my point, Tom.
Samantha Power, head of USAID, went there a couple of years ago announcing that USAID had funded with U.S. high-tech companies an app for the citizens to put on their phones and computers to help them access all of the services of the Ukraine available to them on this app as citizens. Well, the services are paid for by the United States. So it includes pensions, it includes salaries, it includes other government services, their healthcare system, all of the systems of Ukraine that benefit their citizens is funded by the United States.
Well, if that doesn't, I would say, upset people in a country where we're neglecting our own people, I don't know what will. Chris, I want to go to you right now, if I may, to get a little bit of input from your perspective.
Yeah, I don't have the broad geopolitical breadth that Tom has, but I look at it from this standpoint. Vladimir Putin is evil. He is one of the purest forms of evil on this planet. He is our enemy. He'd like to see our way of life, our democracy, our freedoms wiped out, like a lot of other countries, China, Iran, etc., North Korea. We're fighting a proxy war basically against Russia right now. What I don't like, and when I hear Tom say this, I think it ought to rankle every American citizen to hear that we're paying for pensions, we're paying for things besides armaments and basic fundamental weaponry that you need to fight a war. And I think that everybody thought Ukraine would not hold up a week when the invasion started, and now they've shown some mettle, and they have hung in there for a long time, mainly because of our support. I mean, Europe, we know, is not carrying its weight here as usual. So we're sort of the main prop for Ukraine. My concern with the Ukraine is they were a corrupt government before this started. They're probably still a corrupt government now. And the biggest concern for me is we're throwing a lot of this this support into a black hole. Sorry about the phone there. I'm still one of the few people that has a hardline phone. But we're throwing we essentially are burning money in a fire pit, and we don't know where these weapons are going. And I believe, Tom, and I've heard it myself, that this weaponry is getting into the international arms market, and that's unacceptable. You know, they need to keep track and be accountable for all the sophisticated weaponry that we're giving them. And when you go back to the knowledge that that's a corrupt government to begin with, I don't doubt that a lot of this weaponry and a lot of this support is getting into the wrong hands, or it's just supporting a corrupt regime, basically. I mean, Zelensky's shown some moxie. He's from outside the system, but Ukraine's system is fundamentally corrupt. So that's my perspective on it. I think that holding off Putin and his ambitions is a good thing. You know, I fully supporting Ukraine in the beginning, but as I see this, I'm with Tom. We can all see where it's going to end up, and you too, Lou. It's going to be our Vietnam, our Afghanistan, where eventually we just pull out, and then you ask, what was it all for?
You know, the thing that, and I don't want to go off on this tangent, but what's just bugging me in the back of my brain, because there's no secret as to the level of corruption and dishonesty in the Ukraine and some of its entities, like Burisma. And we had a sitting vice president whose son, he thought it would be fit. I mean, you just sit here. This defies every ounce of logic, reason, decency, and morality. And this is the person running the country today. And I'm not saying that as a Republican. I would make the same comment if this man was a Republican. The assessment would be the same. Knowing what we know about this country, we are up to our eyeballs in this place right now. And I have to say one thing about Donald Trump. And I'm not necessarily a fan of Donald Trump because I think he needs to pull in his horns with language. But he approached NATO and mentioned the disproportionate amount of money that the United States was contributing in comparison. I don't get this. We have now 31 NATO nations. 29 of them are on the continent of Europe. I want to go back and make a comment that I mentioned and listening to a primary debate with Nikki Haley telling us that the Ukraine is a cornerstone to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, they are not. They only exist right now because we have allowed them to through support. They are a cornerstone to Europe, if anyone. If you listen to what Tom is saying to you, it makes perfectly good sense. Russia does not want a bordering nation in a position to stage devices that could attack their country. It's just common sense. By the way, folks, we went through this with the Cuban Missile Crisis when they attempted to put missiles in Cuba that had too much proximity to the United States. So there's a consistency here. You know, the thing that's just so troubling is that the American public doesn't understand what's going on in their own country. We're trying to tell you, not to influence you to vote, ladies and gentlemen. We're just giving you something to think about. Go out and get off your laurels and start to follow up on some of these issues. Now, I do know Tom, not only was he an incredibly smart man as a former assistant director of the FBI, but he's an historian, and he comes through with a lot of really interesting information. We've had some very interesting conversations about the Kennedy assassination, which we remind everyone was the loss of the innocence of this country, and the sudden realization that there's trouble in paradise here as well, that there might be issues of credibility or agenda, such as one that feeds the military-industrial complex. You know, we all know what's going on over there. The question is, what's the dollar figure you're going to say no to? Because if you listen to what's going on now, we want another 60 billion. So let's say hypothetically, we give them 60 billion more dollars. Is there going to be another 60 billion more dollars at some threshold, and then another 60 billion? What's the stopgap? And at what point do the European nations step up to the plate and pitch in proportionately? Or you know what? I don't know what to say. Walk away from them. I got to say one thing to you. We talk about the Ukraine like it's this lily white, political entity. It's up to its eyeballs in corruption. For God's sakes, we've got it going on in the United States, and we battle it every day. The problem there, we can't keep up. We need a scorecard to keep up with the players there. And this never-ending funding the Ukraine while we have veterans that are not being taken care of, homeless, mentally ill, our children. any number of entities. This is perplexing. I don't understand this. And you know what, guys? This bangs right into the immigration policies. We are feeding, educating, housing people who have illegally violated our borders. It's a criminal act to cross this border illegally. And by the way, so we're all clear, ladies and gentlemen, all three of us realize there's a need for a migration policy in this country, but it shouldn't be tantamount to you swimming the Rio Grande River, folks. Tragically, the times have dictated that we need to implement technology and even structures and manpower that controls access to this country. That's just the simple reality. What I notice here, though, is just no matter what is put forth by this administration, every single Democrat across the board just rubber stamps it. That's statistically almost impossible that you guys agree on every single topic every single time. I do give them credit, though, for their unity. They're far more, I would say, foxy than the Republicans are. But at some point, I'd like everybody to throw the brakes on with your agenda and understand what you're doing to the future of this country and its young people. Chris, I want to come back to you now to give you another opportunity to speak to this border issue, which is kind of similar to the Ukraine. It's another money pit. Correct me if I'm wrong. And we're listening to mayors, governors, senators who are they're up in arms over this, and they're all Democrats.
Yeah, I'd love to know who's really driving this issue, because as you say, Democratic governors, Democratic operatives don't like what's going on down on the border. Well, a lot of it is, they had their sanctuary city, and then we had the mayors and the city and town and interior city administrations who are sanctioned. They claim they're sanctuary cities, and then they get a taste of it and they go, oh, not in our neighborhood. So I think it's an issue where 60, 65, 70% of the population doesn't like what's going on. And they'd like to see that. This is where that word immigration reform to me is dangerous, because they think it means, a lot of people think it means controlling the borders finally and disincentivizing or removing the incentives to illegally immigrate. But again, to a lot of people who are driving the bus here on the far left wing, these are potential future Democratic voters. So I think there's support from a policy perspective, from a law enforcement, border control perspective, to implement reform, just not the way that the far left wing operatives envision it. I see remain in Mexico. I don't necessarily see building a wall unless it's in very strategic places. But not incentivizing people to come across that border, enabling our border patrol to actually be border patrol, not just Walmart greeters. And these are issues that I really think these are solvable. The border is one of the most solvable issues that we have today, I think, in American politics. I think there's a small number of people, the far left wing, who are driving this administration behind the scenes, have their agenda, when I think it's really truly is contrary to a majority, and I think a sizable majority of our country would like to see it go another way. So it's one of the big issues, I think, for the election. It ought to be one of the biggest issues for this election when you're sitting down to vote. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, I'd say vote. This is the top three issues in this next election, if you will. Vote for secure borders. Don't vote for a person. Vote for someone who will actually secure the borders and make this country more secure and lessen the financial burden on this country, and we just can't accept this many people this fast and do it effectively. So I don't know if that's a political viewpoint or not. I think it's a practical viewpoint. This to control our borders, it means security for this country.
I want to repeat an assessment I made to Tom. I'm gonna make the statement, and I want you to comment on it. We don't have the ability to vet the people coming across the border. We don't have the ability to assimilate them. We don't have the ability to deport them. We have pigeonholed ourselves into a very interesting position. I remind everyone, and I've said this before, and there's a relevancy to this fact. There are approximately 800,000 law enforcement agents in a country of 360 million, ladies and gentlemen. That's federal, state, and local law enforcement agents. If you hear what I'm saying, Chris, what do you think about what I just said to you, that assessment about taking care of the migration issue here? We can't vet them, assimilate them, and we can't even deport them if we had to at this point.
Yeah, we've gutted. I mean, the 800,000, that's, close to 1 million. That's one law enforcement officer per 350 in our population. We've got the resources to do it. And you see governors stepping in. You see Steve McCraw and the Governor Abbott in Texas really stepping up and trying to enforce their border in Texas. They're not getting any help. And of course, the Border Patrol, they're almost the Border Patrol and DPS are working almost against each other. They're trying to keep people out. Border Patrol have been, under this administration, are welcomers. They just, they're just processing. That's it. But again, I go back to the theme, Lou, that it is solvable. It is eminently solvable if everybody got on the same page. Now you got Arizona governor stepping in, sending in the National Guard. People have had enough. They're done with this issue. I think again, there's a large percentage of our country that would like to see these borders controlled, and it has been a deliberate gutting of our Border Patrol. It's a deliberate implementation of policies. Why are we seeing people from God knows how many countries, Lou? You mentioned it earlier. We're not just seeing Mexicans coming in for a better life. We're seeing Somalians. We're seeing Iranians. We're seeing North Africans, Algerians. We're seeing people coming in because they see that there's a vulnerability on our southern border, and it's the easy way in. And that, again, we look at the terrorist watch list and how many have slipped by or have been caught, and then how many have slipped by. Because if we've caught 169, how many have actually gone around, and are gotaways or just slipped in? Gosh, they can smuggle anything into this country. 500 pounds of TNT. Tom worked the bombing of the UN in Iraq. You could smuggle that much ordnance into this country easily, I think, and do some catastrophic things. It could be a catastrophic terrorist attack, or it could be a series of smaller attacks. But it's almost guaranteed that our southwest border has allowed terrorists into this country. There's 169 they caught. We're not here to take advantage and try to establish a better life for themselves. They're up to no good. And we continue to turn our backs on this issue. We worked so hard after 9/11 to implement security across those 800,000 law enforcement agents and officers. We worked so hard after 9/11 to implement security measures, and we've completely compromised all of them by throwing this border open.
Something that the public has to understand, and there's a figure floating around, and I'll give it what I call the 10% variance. They're estimating 1.5 million individuals have entered this country without any encounter of any mechanism we have in place, border, sheriffs, whomever. And so we're clear about how that occurs and why we're able to account for it, ladies and gentlemen. Very simple. Technology, drones, cameras, and observation. So there's a lot of ways that we can account for this number. And if you go into that 10% factor, let's just say 10% of them, which is a relatively low percentage, but 10% of 1.5 million people is a lot of people if they have an agenda that's not consistent with the safety of this country. I tell you, Chris, I listened to the FBI director, and I mentioned this to Tom as well. About 6 months or so in Senate hearings, I happened to catch him on C-SPAN. He mentioned that the southern border of the United States was a threat to your national security. He also mentioned that every 12 hours, the FBI was opening up a case regarding China's activity in this country. Did the president not have the radio on that day, or the attorney general of Mallorca, or Kamala Harris? I mean, did they not hear that? And I hate to throw this word around because I don't like this word, especially in application to someone leading the country. It's called treason, guys. They're talking about, do they have grounds for articles of impeachment? I'm only asking you this. Are you kidding? And I'll tell you flat out, if it was a Republican administration doing this, I would say the same damn thing. No one, based on political affiliation, religious affiliation, ethnic, cultural, your lifestyle, has the right to compromise the safety of this country or the future of our children. So, Chris, what do you think about what I just said here? And we have your FBI director, whether you like him or you don't like him, come out and say that the southern border of this country is a threat to our national security. And before I forget, I looked up a statistic. In excess of 110,000 people have died from fentanyl overdoses in this country so far this year. Let me make you laugh even further. Not that it's funny at all. We're talking about 48,000 people died from gun violence. Really? 480,000 people have died from smoking cigarettes. 40,000 people have died from secondhand smoke. I just gave you the number on fentanyl. I'm starting to wonder if living in this country has become just a big lie. We intentionally disseminate information that is not truthful. I don't want to say inaccurate. It's just simply not truthful. And leading the charge, and we're going to go off onto this topic in a second, I want to get your input on our media, is the media. They're more powerful than any governmental entity because they control the messaging. They decide whether or not the public is going to hear something that's being stated by government. They control our optic and our narrative. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, well, let's just talk about Chris Wray and his testimony, because I've seen it in several of his testimonies where he acknowledges that the southern border presents security risks, but he has a bully pulpit on this issue, that he could whipsaw this administration back into shape if he used it. And I think Chris needs to be far more strident about explaining why this southern border presents and what type of security risk it presents. And I think he's missed the opportunity to do that on several occasions. This is where he needs.
Do you think he's done that intentionally, though?
He's a company man, and he'll talk about the issue in sort of a moderate way, a mild, the southern border presents some risks. It doesn't just present some risks. It presents catastrophic. It presents our greatest vulnerability here in this country to a terrorist attack and many other things, by the way. A lot of people coming across, I look at it as Mariel boat lift on a much broader scale. I mean, Fidel Castro basically emptied his prisons on us. I'm not saying everybody that's coming across the border isn't looking for a better life and won't be hardworking and assimilate into the society. I'm saying a large percentage of them, however, are coming here for all the wrong reasons, and many of them are up to no good. So Chris this is where you got to speak truth to power. And this is where he can use the bully pulpit of the FBI director position to speak to the administration and to the American public and raise the alarm. I mean, I know he did that. He spoke to it, but he didn't do it in a way that was more the way it needed to be done. And then again, that goes back to the strong leadership issue we talked about earlier. But it isn't just a little issue. It's a huge security risk. And he could be one of the people. Mayorkas, forget about it. He's a company man, even more so than Chris is. And I'm afraid that we've got agency heads who, we're law enforcement professionals. We're dedicated to the profession. These are people that know very little about law enforcement, heading up agencies that involve law enforcement, and their primary mission is law enforcement and intelligence. But really what we've installed at the top of these agencies are company men who will allow themselves to be controlled by people within a political agenda. I don't know if that answers your question, Lou, but every time I see Chris testify on this issue or it comes to his, it's presented to him, I see a very moderate, mild response that has no impact whatsoever on the issue.
I'm going to come to you, Tom.
Yeah, I agree completely with Chris that, Ray could use the bully pulpit. He could use a lot of mechanisms to try to get the point across to the American people, to get the point across to the administration that the border is wide open and it's a danger to the United States. And then he continues, and he did right up to a week or two before the Hamas attack in Israel, October 7th, talking about the biggest threat is still white supremacists, MAGA, all of these type of issues that really it's not true. And, he continues to cite that. They continue to say that the January 6th investigations are absolutely continue to be so important now, with more than 1,000 or 8,000 subjects of the investigation. And he just continues that those are entirely political. The January 6th investigation that he's talking about is really political more than it is national security or these other issues. And I just think that, many of the times I've seen him testify, and he's testified about procedures that the FBI does, such as when he sent inspectors to go to Richmond, Virginia, and investigate the investigations of Catholic churches, the memo that was produced in January 23rd, 2023. And I hear that, and he describes the process that he's initiated this important inquiry, and he's not going to have the results until the end of summer. The inquiry was initiated in February, and now it's going to be, the end of summer is come and gone. What was the result of the inquiry? Chris and I were both inspectors in our career path, and we knew that an inquiry into a field office policy or operation or a decision made by the boss of that office, that inquiry would take days, not months. So when he says in July, he testifies before Jim Jordan in the House, before Josh Hawley in the Senate, that, we're going to have an answer by the end of summer. And I said at the time, that's a lie. They should have had the answer in February, not 8 months later.
Great points, Tom.
I think, Tom, what's so interesting about the conversation is we seem to have adopted this practice of weaponizing everything. Like what you're talking about with January 6th is the weaponization of an incident. We weaponize the virus. We want to weaponize the FBI. I think this is the integrity issue in the country. And speaking of the word integrity, I want to just transition you guys into another discussion, which really has left me somewhat perplexed. Joe Biden, as a United States Senator, not a vice president, where I could see there was a little gray area, maybe, even though there isn't, as a U.S. Senator, took classified documents. We're keenly aware of it. We've substantiated this factually. What happened there? Tom, you want to give me some insight on what didn't happen and what should have happened?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he had no business having those documents. I said at the time when that became public that he had boxes of documents at the University of Pennsylvania or in his garage next to his Corvette. And I said that those documents, the only way he would legally have those documents is if Obama declassified them during his administration. As president, he can declassify whatever he wants. And Obama could have immediately said, oh, this is not an issue. I declassified those documents and let Joe Biden have them. That never came out. Biden never said one word. Keep saying Biden. Obama never said one word about Biden being in possession of those documents. Never. So that means that he had no business having them. He has no business removing those documents from a SCIF, if that's where he was briefed in the Capitol building or where it was. He's not lawfully in possession of the documents. Now, the documents at Mar-a-Lago, Trump declassified. And then, the moving companies packing up the White House, they basically take those documents. Now, here's my own theory. I'd like to hear Chris's opinion on this. I think that the purpose of the Mar-a-Lago raid was for the FBI to get back the folder with the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Russia, Russia, Russia. And I think they were afraid that, or hoping, Trump did not make copies of that. That folder was not existing anywhere else outside the FBI. If they took that folder out of Mar-a-Lago, they'd be set. Because that would be the one folder that could do serious damage to the whole FBI investigation, the Democratic Party, you name it. And I think that, to me, that would make a tremendous motivation to go into Mar-a-Lago, and I think they could care less about recovering. They do a smoke screen that there's nuclear material in there. And, seriously doubt that. But the idea being that this would intimidate Trump into now he wouldn't have the mechanism to back up his accusations of the Russiagate investigation that he was being spied on at the time.
Chris, can we get you to contribute on this topic?
Yeah. Well, it's clear there's a double standard here. I'll start with that. Tom's theory, maybe, it's they obviously, in my opinion, a lot of there's been a lot of material out there now that the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was unpredicated. It was not conducted properly. There were a lot of violations of all kinds of different policies and laws. So I think that's already out there. Nothing's ever going to convince the Democratic side of the political aisle about this. But I'll say these documents are, it's two identical situations. I don't doubt that Trump took some documents. I don't doubt that Joe Biden took some documents. They're in all kinds of different secure. Well, I think Trump's documents are far more secure than Biden's. Biden's are laying around in his garage. Trump's are in a locked area in one of the most secure places in the country with plenty of security, plenty of cameras, et cetera. But be that as it may, we see, very clearly here that they were treated very differently. Biden was treated the same genteel way that Hillary Clinton was treated. It was all through lawyers. Mother, may I? Can we please have our documents back? Please, please. And Trump was, kitted out FBI agents in a very public way, executing search warrants on his property when it was considered. And I think they finally got around to it with Biden, but they did it again in that very genteel way with lawyers. Hey, we just happen to have a scrap of paper here, a search warrant here, but can you please show us where the documents are? Can we, let's all do this. Let's all be very gentlemanly about this, very genteel. So big point being double standard, clearly treated differently. And the FBI allowed themselves to be an instrument of that. The theory that Tom has, it's plausible. We say it's all the leadership of the FBI. I'm not totally bought into that at this point. I believe that great work is going on inside the FBI. They're great people, but there's been a sea change in the psyche of the workforce, the DNA of the FBI. What we see in the workforce now are people who come up through these schools that you talk about, Lou, who have the composition is just very, very different. And I think in that generational view, your political views are legitimate. You can bring them to work with you. There are no boundaries. So you see decisions being made even at the local level, at the street, the supervisory level, that I think are highly questionable, using tactical people to go in and do a search warrant in many of these cases that we've seen involving so-called domestic terrorism. Those aren't being made at the highest levels. A lot of those are being made at the supervisory level, the ASAC level, even the SAC level. So I'm not trying to disparage the entire workforce of the FBI, but we have to acknowledge that there's been a cultural shift inside the FBI. And I have many friends whose kids are now in the FBI, and they have to keep quiet. They have to work within the system that now is very different than the system that Tom and I worked under, where it's okay to bring your political views to work. And I think that played into the Mar-a-Lago and Biden investigations. Certainly important decisions were made at the highest levels, but I think some decisions are being made at the supervisory level and just slightly above that as well.
Can I just make a comment to the both of you also, because you've created a pretty good outline as to what transpired in this raid on Mar-a-Lago. I think it's important for people to understand there was a Secret Service detail there that's assigned to Mar-a-Lago. What was it the FBI thought they were going to encounter? Some form of resistance, ladies and gentlemen? Yeah. I mean, this is staring you in the eye. I mean, I don't know how funnier this gets. You have a Secret Service detail assigned to that residence of a former president. and you're coming in almost guns a blazing. I mean, this goes from, I don't even know what to say about this. The tragic part of this discussion is that not enough people in this country are paying attention to what's going on in this country, which is why I'm nervous about what's going to happen next year. I'm not necessarily telling anybody to vote for a Democrat or a Republican. I'm just objectively saying to you, take a look at these past 3 years. Take a look at incidents like Mar-a-Lago, where we're using resources of the FBI to stage an assault on a compound that's being controlled by the Secret Service. Try to stay with me on this one, folks. This just gets worse and worse. Guys, I want to transition because we only have a couple of minutes. What the hell is going on our college campuses? I've mentioned a few times about a term that was coined during the Kennedy administration about the best and the brightest. They referenced all the college kids, all the Ivy Leaguers. And I jokingly say to people, look what the smart people have done to our country. Look what the smart people are doing to our educational institutions. This intellectual arrogance that we experienced, by the way, with Bill Clinton and the old, it depends on what is. We're listening to them talk about the context of a threat. What's going to qualify or quantify a threat? So I want to come to you, Tom, first, and Chris, I'm going to come to you. I'd like to get a perspective on this whole collegiate environment and these are some of MIT is supposedly the best learning institution in the country by reputation. Massachusetts, ironically, leads the country in education. Tom, I'm going to come to you first, buddy.
Well, I think, Lou, that what we're seeing in education is really rampant all the way from kindergarten on up through the university level. And I think that many of these universities, with their woke ideologies and all of the progressive, quote unquote, policies that they've implemented and their entry application policies has really now come out to be public information of what's going on. Now, you just had the lawsuit go on for a couple of years of Asian groups suing Harvard in particular for discriminating against them and whites, lumping Asians in with whites, that they're a privileged group, and therefore all of the effort has to go to helping Hispanics get admitted and get help once they are admitted. And these Asian groups are saying, wait a minute, many of them were immigrants or their parents were immigrants to the United States, and they worked very hard and did excellent work all through school, met all the requirements, and then suddenly they're now able to get admitted to many of these Ivy League schools. But that particular lawsuit was Harvard. So this is kind of what you're seeing, where if you're Black, you're going to be in the group that's privileged. You're the oppressed. And if you're white, Asian, maybe a little bit Hispanic, many of these other groups, forget it. You're oppressors. You're oppressing the Blacks. And that's why they had that two-tier admission policy, helping people get in. The oppressed become students. And I think that, that case did not go well for them, but that's an example of it. Now, when you see the presidents of these universities like Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, when you see them testify in the last couple of weeks for what they're allowing, what speech they allow and what they suppress, you're really seeing a good example of the woke progressive policy at play.
Interesting. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think it starts in grade school. The educational profession all the way up through the universities has become very monolithic. It is a very, very heavy, woke, progressive profession. And there isn't much room for conservative thought or even just moderate thought. I have 9 grandkids. They range from grade school all the way up through high school. And I know what they're teaching. They're being taught. I talk to the kids. I go into the schools. And, I even take the student code, for example. They administer justice differently for what they call people of color, and in a later iteration, disadvantaged students, as opposed to my grandkids. And it's a two-tiered system in the student code. It's a two-tier system of justice. They're actually teaching racism to my grandkids who don't know anything about it. They don't have a racist bone in their body. They play all kinds of different sports. They live in very diverse communities, attend very diverse schools, and they wouldn't know the first thing about racism and wouldn't feel racism if the teachers weren't actually teaching it to them. And then you take it up to the university level. That performance by those college presidents, I think, exposed that what's happening really in our college campuses. And you see it across. I mean, there's a few conservative universities out there, but very, very few. And contrary thought is not permitted in these schools. They're imposing an ideology on an entire population. And that's why I say that's reflected in the FBI workforce now. These are the college graduates. We've had, how many years of this? At least a decade or longer of it's all out in the open. I mean, you will not show conservative thought. Any conservative speakers that come on campus, we're not going to let them, or we're going to run them off, or we're going to drown them out with demonstrations, etc. But we'll be very tolerant towards Hamas and all these other groups. They're allowed to speak their mind, and and it was just it's sort of like Black Lives Matter. They're just out there pushing, exercising their First Amendment rights, if you will. So I'll step back and say collectively, all the way from kindergarten on up, I think that it's an indoctrination that's taking place, and it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree with you. And what's so interesting is I think the cat's out of the bag now, gentlemen. And I also think the chicken's going to come home to roost. If you follow what's going on, the enrollment is down at Harvard, 17% pre-enrollment. They're pulling lots of money away from these Ivy League schools. They're telling them, in addition, that we're not going to hire you. We don't need anybody coming into the workplace that's going to disrupt the workplace because something offended the bubblegum flavor you were chewing. I don't know where this all ends up, but it ties in once again to leadership here. We need a voice that speaks to all people, which I go back and I tap on John Kennedy. I think John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan were probably the two leaders of our lifetime that seemed to be able to pull this country together. For people that didn't understand Reagan, he won 44 states during his election first time, and then 49 of the 50 on his reelection. So he had something going on in his favor. And for those of us that remember John Kennedy, and I don't want to say in simpler years, because we've always had problems. There's always been this undercurrent and agenda and almost diabolical nature in which some people were trying to operate. John Kennedy pulled this country together. And this was a man that not only was this country enamored with him, but the world was, and as Tom has spoken to quite intelligently, it took this country in a different direction. Guys, we're going to wrap for today. I would like, Chris, for you to come back sooner rather than later. I want to have a discussion about the way America is arming itself, and a broader discussion about gun control, mental illness, failed parenting, a lot of these denominators that are common to mass shootings, for example. But unfortunately, we run out of time today. I knew this would be extremely interesting from the both of you based on your life experiences. I do want to tell you something a bit ironic. I was heading in the direction of the FBI. I went into a law enforcement agency, police department. I was going to go for 2 years and then go to the FBI at the age of 23. And that was derailed based on an experience that I had as a very young man. And it altered my whole my career choices. But I'll tell you two guys that in private. But I do want to thank you, Chris, for taking the time. I know that you're a busy gentleman. By the way, Chris is an attorney, and he's got a lot of things on his plate. Tom, I know you give unconditional support to this format that we've created, and you provide a tremendous amount of insight and knowledge and helpfulness in helping people understand what's going on in different avenues of this country today. So I thank you both for today. This is Operation Truth. You can reach us through operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. As I mentioned earlier in prior podcast, we want to broaden this platform to give people an option other than this craziness that you're hearing through Fox, CNN, MSNBC. We are not politically driven. We are truth driven. I want to say this to you in closing. when you go to vote, vote for the person that's going to keep your children safe and ensure their future and the future of this nation. We're not telling you to vote for, guys. We're telling you, see the forest for the trees and know when to come in from the rain. Thank you, guys, both of you, and I thank for everyone listening today. We'll see you next episode.